Good afternoon, everybody. We appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join Brian and I. My name is Chet Hayes. I'm the CTO of Vertisoft. We're a company who works with public agencies to bring them some of the latest and greatest emerging technology to help them in their cloud endeavors. Brian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Price, CEO and co-founder of CloudTamer. CloudTamer is a company that focuses on providing a cloud governance platform to help customers of all sizes better control and govern their cloud. And today you'll hear a little bit about why that's so important, especially in the public sector.
Great. And so today really is to be a kickoff of 4 webinars that we're focusing on as it relates to governance in the cloud, and especially for private public sector organizations. And today we're going to talk about the definition of governance, why it matters. I think, as you'll hear, both Brian and I in our experience have come to realize that governance really is the key for a successful cloud program in any organization, especially public sector, and we'll talk about some unique challenges there. And after today, we're going to do 3 other additional webinars to do some deep dives into that, and we're looking forward to being able to talk to more about continuous compliance. I think that's the one on the 17th. The 31st is the automation of cloud access and orchestration, and then the last one is about budget visibility and control in the cloud, and that's going to be on September 19th. And we look forward to having you on those as well. So let's just jump in and get started and really talk about why governance truly is the key for success in the public cloud. And we're going to go over four areas here. Want to set the stage and talk about the challenges that we have seen in the public cloud. We want to talk about some of the impacts that we have witnessed as it relates to how these challenges have affected programs, and then talk about specifically how governments can actually address these issues, and then actually share with you some specific tactics and things that we have seen actually work in a couple of different agencies. So with that, let's just jump right into that. I like this slide for a couple of reasons. One, it pretty much describes how some agencies are in their evolution to cloud migration. In that lower right corner, that really represents what you considered best practices. And you'll look at it, right? There's a lot of different accounts going on, a lot of different subscriptions. And if you're familiar with any of the best practices that are published by, whether it be Amazon in their AWS Governance at Scale document or Microsoft Azure, you know that it's best practices to use a lot of different accounts, multiple accounts, and subscriptions to help spread things out, manage. I like the term in our notes here, we call it the blast radius if something were to go wrong, but it really helps manage all of that. But when you start doing that, the number of accounts start to grow, and you have to start dealing with things like security and budget, and it becomes complex, and it starts to become difficult to manage. And many of the organizations that we're familiar with, and we have seen them try to manage all of that, whether it's in spreadsheets or in wiki sheets, just it becomes more of a challenge that as organizations grow and become more advanced and start using more of the cloud to keep control of all of that. And if we, in addition to that, these other things, I think, come into play here. One, you've got to make sure that you stay on budget. And 2, these next 2 numbers, I actually like them, right? That first number in a study that was done, 29% of government organizations had admitted to being breached in the last year. And then, ironically or not, 29% also admitted to failing a compliance audit. I would argue that those 2 numbers are related for a reason. And so I think a lot of these things we see generically as a lot of challenges related to the public sector. And Brian, I think there's a couple of, why don't you walk us through some of these other specific things that you've seen?
Yeah, Chad, and the public sector challenges are unfortunately a little bit more complex. It's like another added level on top of just these general kind of cloud migration challenges that every organization faces. So these considerations, like staying on the right side of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which, if you're not familiar, is actually almost centuries old regulation, but resurfaced in the world of the cloud, really makes it difficult so that an agency, in a cloud model where every developer potentially has the ability to spend money that traditionally in IT has always been something that's been controlled by a separate group. Not having those controls in place can cause violations unintentionally of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Obviously, Chet mentioned just a second ago around making sure that you're complying with the different regulations. FedRAMP is paramount across all the federal government, right? But depending on your agency, if you're dealing with healthcare data, you might need to comply with HIPAA, or financial and credit card data, right, with PCI, and other regulations are also super important. Making sure that spend is tracked across different colors of money. So you have O&M funding versus RDT&E funding versus different contract CLINs, right? Making sure all of that can be tracked, not just at the singular cloud bill you get at the end of the month from AWS, Azure, or whoever your reseller is. And then lastly, just the managing access across high and low side environments, which we realize not every public sector customer has to worry with, but it is something that's an important consideration. And then building on that, the experience, if you're really looking at the high and low side environments. Chad, on the next slide there, yeah, we're really seeing this almost difference in experience, right? From the low side environment potentially having a different set of cloud platforms or security impact levels that you need to kind of worry about. The way that you access that environment and the processes you have to go through being almost completely different than when you experience that on the high side. And again, not every customer has to worry about this, but when you do, and you have both of these differences, it really creates a lot of questions, right? You have somebody that comes in and the experience, in order to get absolutely familiar with using the environment, is so critically important to get right, because without that experience being consistent, then all of a sudden you have this polar opposite use of the cloud potentially in your different environments. So this really goes back to the mindset of what is cloud. And Chad, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about how you should think about it, maybe not think about it.
Yeah, I'm going to start with how I don't think about it. I've seen this a lot, and over the past, I was going back looking at my notes and just stuff over the past 10 years, and is the amount of time I've been working in EC2 and AWS and some other cloud environments. So it's ironic, it's been a long time, and as we've evolved and our thought processes have evolved, we've definitely come to the realization that I like this document here, right? Cloud really isn't a place. Right, and we hear a lot of people talk about lift and shift and say, hey, we're going to take our applications and move it from our data center, we're going to move it into the cloud, right? And that's great and all, but really that's just moving from one data center really to somebody else's data center. And they're not really taking advantage of all the things that really exist in that cloud really brings to the table when you're using it as a model and a way of actually doing business and transacting business. So when these conversations that we have with both government agencies, integrators, and other organizations, we want them to start thinking about all this other stuff that goes along with it, right? It's the people process technology, and this is probably not anything new to a lot of people who are joining us, right? You've heard these things before, but when you think about what cloud enables along these same lines and how that affects the model, it goes back and can greatly influence the success or failure of an organization in their cloud adoption. Technology, big buzzwords, right? If we're buzzword compliant, we're talking about DevSecOps and the ability to quickly create an application, create code, get it checked in, go through an integrated pipeline so that automatically gets deployed into production. Those frequent code deployments and that type of model really is enabled from the cloud, but there's brand new processes that go along with that, on how you manage your change control board, on how you manage that entire process. And in addition, it changes how we buy solutions. So if we go back, this is going to make me very old. 25 years ago, doing work in one of the IC agencies right out of college, we were working on a project, and we had to figure out how much compute capacity that we needed at any given point at the peak, so that we could procure all of that hardware up front, so that could be used on that project. And turns out that we only hit that capacity, maybe twice a year for a couple of days. So we had to. So today with cloud and on that concept of pay-per-use, pay-per-consumption, that changes an entire way of how organizations think about how they buy IT. And for people as well, right? It changes how things maybe get aligned there, but at the same time, there's lots of concerns about job changes, about skill sets being going into obsolescence. And I think there's a lot of goodness there in both opportunity as well as challenges as we think about how we want to be able to empower the people to take advantage of the cloud inside of an organization. And when you hear these things, people, process, technology, and all these things seem pretty straightforward, but clearly there's a lot of organizations who continue to struggle with that today. And maybe, Brian, you can talk about what those challenges look like to you.
Yeah, and so the things that we've seen, this is recurring over and over again, and I would say, while this is a focus today in public sector, and we'll kind of shine a light on it from a public sector perspective, it's not exclusively public sector, but they really come down to, people, money, and security, right? So the challenges of, determining what the current state of all your users across your enterprise is in the cloud, making sure that access is consistent, making sure that, the onboarding process and the offboarding process is consistent as well. And that picture of what your cloud presence looks like is available in real time because it's possible. But realizing that is a challenge that we have a ton of CIOs and CISOs that really struggle with. The second piece, really around, money, right? And making sure that, again, as you transition that scenario that Chet was describing, right, the reality in the cloud is you don't have to think about what your maximum capacity of a system is. You can scale up as long as you've built an architecture that allows you to do that when you need it. But making sure that you're adhering to budgets in a pay-per-use model. Not every single account or workload maybe needs to scale up to meet an increased user demand. In fact, maybe in some cases, you don't want to do that because of some sort of nefarious activity that's happening in your environment in a sandbox account or a non-production environment. And then lastly, around security and compliance, that kind of third challenge that we see over and over again. It really is all about making sure that you've put up these boundaries so that people have the control that they need, but make sure they don't exceed that level of access. And make sure that, ultimately the environment is set up consistently. So now that we've kind of talked about some of these challenges, we'll talk about, kind of what's the impact of what those challenges kind of cause us to see. So, first off, this idea around, just manually managing cloud complexity, right? It is so difficult, we find, in today's day and age, first off, to find good cloud engineers alone, but to find, a team member, right, on your team that is an AWS and an Azure expert, and then you find someone that's an expert in that, and you bring them into your team, and then all of a sudden, perhaps you're using what's called the cloud broker technology that sits between the user and their cloud service provider, and it causes them to really have a dumbed down experience of what the cloud offers. And so, this complexity of manually managing that with just people that have to worry about the complexity of the environment itself, the complexity of the resources that are there, and again, finding those right people, and these manual processes are just incredibly challenging to kind of get right in a world that everything is completely automated. So one thing that we've seen is, unfortunately, a bit of an anti-pattern is something called Guardians at the Gate. And this is something that AWS, I guess, brought up maybe about a year and a half ago via a blog post. But this idea really around, you've got a single group or team that, unfortunately, as your usage scales, everything still relies on them, and they're kind of struggling to make sure that they're making all the concerns around budget and security and operations, and without thinking about the problem differently, these guardians are ultimately going to hinder the innovation, right, of what's going on in that environment. The second area is really around the site and control of cloud budget. So one thing that we hear often when we go to talk to some different customers, usually early on, and they talk about the idea around, well, we can track all of our cloud spend because we use tags. Well, the reality is you get a little bit deeper into using cloud service providers, and you realize A, not every resource can be tagged. And B, if you've effectively tagged all your resources, there's still usually an implementation gap where you need to make sure that everything that you're deploying is truly infrastructure as code in order to make sure all of those tags are fully traced, right? So, using that example, that Chet was showing before in that very first slide around the best practice pattern of using multiple accounts or multiple subscriptions, that model is certainly a lot better than solely using tags, but there's still some gaps that you still have to address, such as, on this slide, we talk about the differences of tracking those different types of funding, especially in the public sector, where the funding expires in different intervals. Maybe it's a 1-year fund versus a 2-year fund. Making sure that you can actually control that in a way that ensures that as budgets get exceeded or close to being exceeded, you've got those different rules in place to be able to make sure that you don't have a spending emergency. The regions that we all are working in, potentially it's just the difference between commercial AWS and GovCloud, or Azure commercial versus Azure government, right? But seeing that some of these regions have limitations on how to see spend, and then ultimately, I mentioned before the Anti-Deficiency Act requiring that real-time visibility, which unfortunately the cloud service providers, really just don't handle quite as well. So, that really, is, at its core, if you're using manual processes to look at this from a financial perspective, you're always going to be introducing more risk and struggling to catch up. The last, real, kind of impact we see of some of these challenges are really around, again, that high to low environment. And, in that environment, a couple things just to kind of keep in mind, I think that a lot of customers, kind of see is that when you're using these different environments, if you've got different systems that you're needing to request access through, and there are different processes, maybe it's low side, you're using a tool like ServiceNow, and then high side, you've got Remedy, right? And there's different workflows and different teams that are involved. And unfortunately, the user doesn't have a clear vision or understanding of where they stand in that approval process. It becomes a very frustrating experience. And then if you have to wait, right, because to get this cloud account, you've got to get access to 3 or 4 or 5 other systems. Again, that becomes another challenge, right, in order to limit that productivity. And then, lastly, really here we talk about this idea of switching context, right, which certainly is hitting a button on a KVM if you're used to working in a low versus high environment, AWS commercial versus C2S. But, the context switching of what services are available in one environment versus what services are available in the other environment, really just create a challenge, in these silos that cause this unnecessary work to stitch everything together. So, at the end of the day, that's really, a challenge that we find that, those impacts, right, are really what we find a lot of organizations face. So I'm going to turn it back to Chet maybe to talk a little bit about how he's seen cloud governance really be that challenge buster.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And I appreciate all of that. And it's interesting, right? As we go back and we look back at our history and a lot of the things that we're seeing where organizations struggle with, these governance things aren't necessarily what I would say technical in nature, right? It is really about, how do we deal with the complexity of multi-accounts? How do we make sure from a budget perspective we're managing that? And how do we deal with the security side of it? It's quite interesting to see that. And, as from an organization, I really like this chart, right? There's these sort of 10 different questions you can ask, and it can probably give you an idea of whether or not, maybe your current governance isn't working, or you may need cloud governance in a different way. It's amazing when you ask an organization, would you have any idea of how many cloud accounts you have? A lot of them can't answer that question. They're not even sure. It's interesting to see the number of organizations who are actually tracking enforcement via a spreadsheet. And what do I mean by that is they have a spreadsheet with all these controls that are listed out, and then they have a list of environments, and they're going in and they're just manually checking off to say, okay, this environment, this control, that's enforced. I guess that's good for a paper record, but if you think about this concept of continuous monitoring, continuous enforcement, it falls short. My favorite one on this is that last one, number 10. I've dealt with a lot of organizations where they're working with a cloud PMO or a governance office, and they view that office as the office of no, right? The department of no. Every time we go ask them for something, no, can't do that. No, can't do that. And I think really what you want your governance to be is not the department of no, but the department of, I'm going to say go, right? You want to be able to have the governance be more of an enabler, an enablement. And that's really what is key with all of this and what governance really brings to the table. And I do want to focus on this for just a minute, and Brian alluded to it. We have seen sort of two approaches that agencies and organizations have taken related to governance. The first is this concept of brokerage, this concept of cloud broker technology. That's been around a long time. I've myself have used it, but as the more we have dealt with it, I think it provides some limitations. One, it inherently hijacks the native cloud experience. So you end up having to use the cloud broker technology, their interface, to get to what you want to do. It sometimes, well, in many cases, will limit your access to the command line interfaces and the actual APIs that the commercial CSP provides. And you're a little beholden to the innovation of the broker and their ability to keep up with the commercial cloud provider in terms of what services are available. So, CSPs, Amazon's cranking out new stuff all the time. If the cloud broker, if they're not as quick to keep up with Amazon's deployment or even Microsoft deployment of services in the cloud, you may have to wait a while to be able to use a new service through the broker technology. And so I also think that at least the stuff that I have seen, it's more reliant on humans and more manual type of processes and not really automated. So it works, it can get the job done. Maybe that's good for small organizations, but when we compare that to something that we view as what we call it more enabling technology and the differences there, I think it's sort of a night and day difference. And I think this concept of using enabling technologies is more useful for organizations. At the end of the day, these technologies allow teams direct access to the native cloud consoles, the command line interfaces, the APIs, stuff that they already know, that they already understand. They don't have to go off and learn something else. So I think there's beauty to that, just purely from a simplicity perspective. But then the fact that, again, it's real-time speed, right? As soon as AWS releases a new offering, then you can go in and it's readily available. And it's very easy to control whether or not you allow a development team to access that or not, and without having to wait for an entire development cycle. So I think there is a lot of value to that. And when you start combining that with budget enforcement and budget management, so that's all built in real time, I think you will start to see the power of how the enabling technology can put those guardrails in place, which allows organizations to, again, be, from a governance perspective, be more accelerate, that time to market is a lot faster. So I think we strongly believe that organizations really should look at that approach from a governance perspective than maybe the brokers. So, and you'll hear us talk about this a lot, and you've probably heard these themes both as Brian and I have talked. There's these 3 pillars of governance at scale that we like to hit on, and you'll hear us call these the ABCs, right? It's, how do you deal with account management, especially when best practices dictate that you're using different accounts, maybe even for individual programs. You could end up with hundreds of accounts within your organization. And if you separate those out between dev and test, then that just explodes. So being able to align all of that, have a common place to keep control of all the accounts, a user to log into one spot and have that to federate right out into the right account is going to be critical. Budget enforcement, Brian's already talked about the Anti-Deficiency Act and how important that is, but just in general, being able to manage to a program budget to make sure a program is profitable is key. And lastly, compliance. That's huge, especially in the public sector. It's getting better. A lot of organizations, one too many buttons here, sorry about that, but before we go on, a lot of organizations that we've seen used to think that, hey, AWS is FedRAMP, right? They would hear that. And they would think that every service that AWS offered was FedRAMP authorized. And we know that that's not true. So from a compliance perspective, if we really want to make sure that we're only using services that have achieved FedRAMP moderate, we want to be able to put in policies to allow a program to be able to spin up those services that meet that requirement. Brian talked about HIPAA or other things. It's the same thing, being able to put in policies in place that, again, allows the programs the flexibility to be in a console doing their own things, but those guardrails to make sure that we are meeting the specific compliance requirements that our program or agency does have. And all of this, governance comes down, and Brian used that word. Governance is this challenge buster. All these challenges that we've talked about, a good governance process will resolve a lot of those and actually provide a lot of value to your organization. And I think the key here as we build this out, right, I'm going to just build out the slides here. We firmly believe that a good governance solution is one that's all about self-service. That's what the cloud is all about, self-service, being able to go in there, do their let developers, the people in the program do their thing when they need to do it. And that we tack on with assurance. Good governance will put those guardrails in place to make sure that they don't go rogue, if you will. The other thing I think is important is this concept of enforcement, not just alert messages. I've used some tools in the past where it's about compliance, right? But what it will do, it'll let you go in, it will let you take an action that is actually in violation of a policy, and then come in over the top and say, oh, whoops, you shouldn't do that. It will send an alert. Maybe it can turn it off. But the fact that it let me do it to begin with seems broken. And so we want to be able to enforce that up front and let a user know and say, hey, you know what, can't do that. But at the same time, provide the flexibility for organizations to say, you know what, there is maybe a justifiable reason. In this case, I need an exception to my policy, and be able to go through an exception process and be able to document that so that that's all, everybody knows what happens, everybody knows that, hey, this exception's been taken, and we can point to that within our governance structure. So I think those are very key things to have in place. And when you do that, you see some great return on investment. We have seen time in and time out that it does reduce your labor costs. You need less people trying to decipher an AWS bill. If any of you have ever spent some time doing that, you'll know how painful that can be, especially in a large organization. And if you're doing multiple accounts, that starts to get wieldy and cumbersome. So being able to deal with that, you're able to do that. Again, we talk about self-governance. We know for sure that will actually help reduce your number of compliance audits and failures, because you'll be able to go in. It's real-time enforcement, so you'll actually be able to show. One of the worst offenders is a misconfigured S3 bucket. We see that all the time in the press, and here this would allow you to know that when that is configured, that policy will be enforced, so that you're not going to have a leaky S3 bucket out there sharing a bunch of personal information. So a lot of goodness with governance. So with that in mind, let's we'll shift gears just a minute. I want to talk about some best practices, some tactics that we've seen that I think an organization can start doing today to shore up their existing governance process, or if they don't have it, maybe some steps that they can take to get going with that. So a couple things. One, I apologize for that. I got to learn how to use SharePoint here. So we've talked a lot about being able to push down, to delegate. And so again, we use this concept of think deputies, not sheriffs. We don't want to have one central, all-powerful governance office making all the decisions. We want to push as much of that down as we can, and have, if you will, the deputies being able to manage that where it makes sense. And the more you can push decisions and adjudication down, the more agile and effective I think your organization is going to be. The other thing that we would actually encourage organizations to think about is come up with a way to actually automate the creation of your baseline infrastructure for projects. And what I mean by that, you've got a lot of smart people who know about VPCs and security groups and subnets and how to set up, auditing and the logs, and have that scripted out. Maybe have a baseline CloudFormation template that's already there. That the people who know how to do that, it's already set, so that they can just give that to a program, and a program can use that to automate their baseline infrastructure. Don't let the individual teams have to worry about how that all comes to be and how that gets set up. I think there's some value in creating those baseline and reusable templates, and you'll find that from a governance perspective, as that ties into everything else you're doing, you'll see a lot of value out of that. In addition to that, think about how you automate your policies. And so I really like this example, and because I think there's a huge amount of value an organization can get from this. And in the case that you're seeing here, a user had gone into an EC2 console. They wanted to stand up an M4, extra large EC2 instance, and they happened to wanted to do that in the US East instance. And by being able to automate the governance, we can go in and assign policies at a variety of levels within our organization, and there's a lot of power to this. So let's say we're in a government agency, and we want to make sure that, hey, if we're using AWS, we want to make sure that the only regions we access are regions within the US. Or maybe we only want to limit to GovCloud regions. You can go in and you set that policy, and that gets set up within the console, and we want to make sure that that gets enforced in real time. And in this case, that's the agency policy. We've got another policy down here at the department level where they have set up a policy related being able to limit which types of EC2 instances that a user can configure. As you know, not all these EC2 instances are created equal. Some are really cheap, some are really expensive. And if a department wants to be able to have some control on what that looks like, they can say, you know what, we only want to allow these instances. And then at a program level, we can have policy even assigned there. And in this case, we wanted to make sure that only services that have received a FedRAMP High authorization are used. And we just happen to use that as, in this case, is the one that got flagged. But the beauty of this, the user's inside the AWS console, he does his normal thing, he'll get an immediate message saying, hey, that's unfortunately not allowed to do that. You could learn more about those permissions, and there's ways for them to understand the process, and even if they need an exception, there's ways for them to get that exception. So being able to automate all that across the entire organization gives one visibility to the entire organization from a compliance perspective, to know that from all the way from the top level of the agency all the way down to their individual programs, that the right policies and procedures are in place. It gives them the ability to grant access to all their development teams and know that those guardrails are there and exist. So I think that is hugely powerful there. So we can go on. The other thing I do want to talk about is this concept of budgets. And the same thing, right? Organizations have budgets, those flow down to departments, they'll flow down to programs. If you've ever tried to track a bill, decipher an AWS bill, sometimes that's very difficult. And in a lot of cases, AWS billing, that doesn't get finalized to I think it's the 15th of the following month. And it's very important to be able to have real-time, or at least near real-time visibility into your current cloud spend. So like we had the enforcement, you want to be able to manage your budgets in the exact same way. And Brian talked about the color of money. You want to be able to track those funding streams, where they're at, what's getting spent, what's available, and how that all ties together. And you've got to be able to report that back to the stakeholders that really care about it. So people who care about budgets are probably going to be a little bit different than the people who care about policy and compliance. But all these things are related, and you need to be able to bring that together to create that common single view of everything. That is truly important. So Brian, these are sort of general things that apply to everybody. I think the next slide is something more specific related to classified environments. If you want to talk maybe a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Chet. So, Chet's describing some of these principles that we think every organization can implement. I'll just kind of get this lens around, that low to high environment, and foundationally making access just be as seamless as possible in your environment, right? Whether it is low or high. And so, when I was describing this earlier, I mentioned about the difference in different systems and request workflows. Well, there's ITSM solutions that are out there that can help automate this process. So, making sure that you've got workflows that are, again, understood, they're documented, they're transparent, going back to that concept of self-service, and it's consistent. So if your organization, high side or low side, is going to this one location to request everything from a new workstation to a cloud account, make sure that that is the experience that's consistently trained in the user's minds. Once you're inside of the cloud environments, making sure that you've got services that simulate some of the high side services, low side. So we have one customer will describe a little bit more about the use case in a little bit around, how they've built out really this platform to do development, where you have the availability of these services so that you can build as much as possible low side and then transition that up into higher side environments. Making sure that you get CI/CD services that are consistent. Don't be using, as an example, CloudBees low side, Jenkins high side. Try to make sure that your platforms that you're building and deploying are consistent across your classification domains. Building in emulation tools. So there's platforms that are available from companies like Digital Age Experts with their Shift platform. Sequoia Combine also offers these emulation engines that let you simulate what it's like to run a low side, or simulate what it's like to be on the high side when you're actually in the low side environments, which are super critically important. And then lastly, just making sure that you've got a centralized way of accessing those environments. On the high side, most customers that are deploying applications into the C2S region inside of AWS are familiar with a platform called the CAP, or the Cloud Access Portal, which in essence allows a user to simply choose a role and then they can get into that account. We'll make that experience just like that low side, so that experience is really something that a user can look forward to. And then, just kind of to summarize, I think, some of these things, and if you think that these, approaches, right, some of these resonate, right, with you, one of the things that, again, Cloud Tamer, we offer is our Cloud Tamer Cloud Governance solution. And really at its core, we work across multiple cloud service providers, both AWS and Azure, in the different classifications domains to give that visibility and make it simpler to get control around costs and automating compliance. These principles that, Chet has, kind of described through the challenges and these concepts are at its core what our platform is built around to make sure that customers have a simple and easy solution to move workloads as they move workloads in the cloud, to fully manage those at scale. Ultimately, beyond just our overall kind of cloud governance platform, our mission as Cloud Tamer is real simple, right? It's to make people's lives easier in the cloud through the products that are built by our team that are absolutely passionate about solving this problem. And we're fortunate enough to be trusted by a number of federal agencies. So when you think about our platform, when you think about these problems, we'd like you to think about, not just what we offer in terms of technology, but going back to the people, the process, and the technology, the experience our team has to help you along the way with that journey. So, with that, I did want to, maybe go into some case studies here and to talk a little bit about, what we've seen, in different environments. So, I think first maybe to tackle a couple things here, is, this quote that we've had one of our customers say, and I never will forget this. This one customer came in, he sits down and he's just very nervous, and you can tell he carries a lot of weight on his shoulders, and he goes, so these are the 5 things that keep me up at night, right? And while, his 5 things, right, were things like making sure that people aren't buying, 3-year reserved instance purchases using 1-year, funding, right? Making sure that someone's not deploying workloads into the cloud using services that aren't FedRAMP compliant, making sure that someone doesn't buy something through Marketplace to circumvent a, basically a purchasing policy that the agency had, making sure that someone isn't hosting a website off a public S3 bucket that really goes around some sort of communications process. Those were his 5 things, right? But everybody has their own 5 things, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about some different kind of use cases that we've helped different customers with to solve their 5 things and their 5 challenges that they've had. So Chet, maybe we have one customer in common. I think that you've supported for quite a few years before we even got involved at NASA. Do you want to describe maybe just a little bit of some of the challenges that you saw while you're there, and I can maybe fill in what we've kind of helped them kind of overcome since those early days of cloud adoption?
Yeah, Brian, and it's funny. Everybody I've told, I said I wish Cloud Tamer had existed when we started the NASA work several years ago. This was back, I can't remember how many years ago this was, but this was back when NASA first, from a business perspective, they had to move, a bunch of business applications out of their own data centers. They moved them into the cloud. I think we had it was 40 or 60 different apps that had to go, right? That had to move. And so the program that was created to do that, there was a cloud office. NASA had not done this before, so this was a learning thing, and they wanted to structure this as a managed services type of opportunity. And at the time, we chose the brokerage model, right, from a governance perspective. That was the model we went down. We had picked a tool to help us with a little bit of the challenges that go around brokerage. But one of the things that we struggled with early on, we got all these applications got migrated. It was great, but the pain points, right? The things that we would hear back from the individual programs were, one, because we did this managed service type of approach and the way we handled the accounts, it was the way they didn't get access to the production account, and it was very difficult for them to get their own accounts even set up. So it just took some time, and because it was all very manual and how that process went down. And on top of that, at the time, and I think a lot of some of our lessons learned when we fed that back to AWS and some of the challenges we were having, and you'll see a lot of the best practices that are in AWS, that Cloud at Scale, that document, come from a variety of different customers, but I think some of it came from some of the pain we saw at NASA, in that, especially as related to billing. So we were using at the time just a couple of accounts, and for the most part, it was very easy, to tag instances and be, these instances belong to this program, and we can figure out the cost for that. And that wasn't too bad, but it soon became very difficult to figure out, well, how do you deal with egress, right? How do you allocate cost fairly for that when some programs are larger than others? And so we learned early on that doing that in an individual, in a single account was probably going to be very painful, and trying to figure out how to move those to separate accounts was, I think, important there. So, and then from a compliance perspective, the way that was all done manually. I wasn't joking when in some cases, you had a spreadsheet of controls, of things we had to watch for, and making sure that each environment that we had set up, we had gone off and we had checked for that. And the one thing that worked really well there, though, was we did have a CMDB set up, so we knew that not only what what services were being used, we went a little bit deeper in that. We actually knew exactly what APIs and libraries were being installed, and the value there was, when there was an SSL leak and there was a big data call from the government to find out who was using this version of the SSL library. Turns out that we were able to answer that in about 30 minutes, compared to many organizations who took them weeks. So there was some goodness there. But all in all, successful project. A lot of good things came of that, but definitely some good lessons learned. And maybe it's a good transition, to talk about the evolution of what that's turned into.
Yeah, and Chet, that really great background, and some of those stories, when we first got engaged, probably about 2017, 2018, very much, hearing about, both, some positives about being able to find things like that SSL vulnerability, but also, some of the challenges and, one of the foundational, and I'll cover just two foundational things with NASA that we helped them solve, was really around this user access piece. So making sure that it was simple and easy for users to be able to go and log in using the standard method they'd log into any other NASA system to get into the cloud. And so, as Chet mentioned, there's a brokered kind of tool that was in place and being used there that really, timed people out after a period of time. And it really made it so it was very difficult to get a consistent, easy-to-use experience. So we tied into the enterprise authentication systems that NASA used through a SAML provider that they use, so that literally user could come in, use their HSPD12, smart card, log in, go to, what basically became Cloudtamer hosted in their environment, and very quickly get into their cloud environments based on the level of access they need. And when they get into Cloudtamer, they simply click the button, right, and they're directly there into their overall cloud accounts. And again, depending on the user, depending on the level that they needed of access, maybe they had access to go full admin to deploy whatever they needed to, right? In other cases where, you're deploying things in a CI/CD model where, maybe in a dev environment you have full admin. In a production environment, it's much more locked down because really everything should be fully autonomously deployed. Or, on the other side, maybe you just have a different role. Maybe you're a finance person, right? And being able to have visibility purely to get into the overall, finance and billing views inside of AWS, but really you shouldn't be touching other things, right? So that level of role-based separation is something that we help to make it super easy for that team to manage. Another area was really around spending insights and enforcements, where there were a number of different programs that had concerns around making sure that as more users got access to their cloud environments, that they actually didn't hit budget spending caps, and making sure that when they did, before that happened, there were these proactive controls in place, not only just to give that visibility, but to actually set up alerting and actually restrictions. One of the coolest examples that I've seen where, this idea of moving past guardians at the gate and delegating control down was through, one of our customers in this environment that really set this set of active enforcement actions so that when finance needed to make some quick changes to budgets, automated actions would happen in those environments to start to stop or slow or reduce spending in, say, a non-production sandbox or a dev environment. And again, that model of delegating access and control is possible through automation. It's possible through what CloudTamer offers to stitch things together for the enterprise so that the teams that we're supporting there aren't having to build a ton of middleware to do that themselves. One of the other examples, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, is kind of what full development looks like at scale. And this is another customer in our DoD space that was really facing some challenges where they wanted to have all their developers to have, really that, complete experience of using low to high side, in environments and being able to build as much low and then kind of move that over to the high side and have, just this experience of, full innovation that's possible. So, but the thing was the challenges at scale, right? So this planned environment was supposed to support upwards of 10,000 users, right? And 10,000 developers all having somewhat unfettered access to the cloud. What could possibly go wrong? Well, again, coming into, really what this architecture looked like was, again, having this native access to AWS, having self-service that's absolutely paramount through the entire process. When a new project needs to be created, there's a process that everyone understood how to go through. CloudTamer kind of sits in the center from a governance perspective, but there's all sorts of other surrounding technologies that help to make security in through the entirety of the architecture, right? So auditing and logging is just programmed to happen automatically as soon as a new cloud account, is stood up, monitoring, the VPC configurations and things like that to make sure that people aren't really able to go outside of that so that the developers can come in, they can focus on what they need to build, and they don't have to worry about the kind of underlying infrastructure. And then even from a compliance oversight perspective, that's just available for different people at different levels in the organization to get that real-time visibility, across their environment. And really the results allowed them to have, the scalability, the speed, the security, and then the compliance that was just available for them, across their environment. So with that, I know we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of open up for Q&A and see if we have any questions, Mariana.
Thank you, Brian. Yep, a couple have come in. So maybe Brian, teeing this first one up for you. Isn't resource tagging good to manage cloud spend and cost allocation?
So great question. I alluded to this earlier. So tagging is a great starting point, but if you stop there, you're going to have some issues at scale, right? So I'll give you an example. So one of our customers has a lot of costs that they see in their cloud accounts due to egress. So basically data leaving their cloud environments, right? AWS makes it free to transfer data in, but getting it out, you're gonna end up paying for it, right? And what they've seen is, depending on how their researchers and engineers are building their applications, that can cause a pretty significant spike in cloud costs, right? So, if you're using purely and relying solely on tagged resources, and you have, say, an account that does have multi-tenancy, so you've got 4 or 5 or 10 or more applications deployed inside of that account, unfortunately, egress costs are one of those examples of resources that you cannot tag, right? So you're going to see a lump cost, this data transfer cost, is a line item on your bill at the end of the month. You're going to be like, how the heck did I spend $10,000 or $50,000 or more in terms of costs, right? And there's no easy way to break that down. So that's why, it's super important to look at that multi-account, multi-subscription strategy, because then you can start to break out your different accounts and workloads and applications in these different individual accounts, right? So let's just, as an example, you have a single application, you can have maybe 3 or 4 or more different accounts used to deploy that across different lifecycle environments, right? And then the next application has the same, right? So within that account, you can still use tags to help segment some resources, but you're not limited to only what resources can be tagged. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks, Brian. And I think we've probably got time for one more question that came in. Maybe Chet, if you can handle this one. How can governance help if my challenge is getting a handle on shadow IT?
What organizations have shadow IT? That's probably the big thing. And so I think that's the key, right? I think if organizations are willing to go, again, we talk about going from the cloud management office of being an office of no to being an office of go, right? If we think about in that model, we've got a governance process in place that can automate it. If an organization, even down to the developers, the program levels, people have access to the accounts and say, hey, I need to spin up something really quick to test something out. So instead of somebody going with their own personal credit card, spinning up something rogue and doing their own thing, they've got an environment that guardrails are on, that they can go and do their thing with it and manage it. So I think it can help. Will it get rid of it entirely? Yeah, probably not. But I actually think as organizations, if developers feel that they've got a place they can go to get to what they need to do, and it's sanctioned by the organization, then I think it will go a long way to helping with that.
And Chet, I'll just build off of that as well. That user experience piece is so critical, right? Because if you make it just as easy for someone to get a cloud account, a sandbox account, to try out a service, like in Chet's example, in the enterprise, right, as it is to go home, swipe a credit card, get an AWS account, and potentially put your organization's sensitive data into that unsecured account, then you've won the battle, right? If you've made it difficult and it's a 8-week process or a 2-day process, right, when something that can be done almost instantaneously, you're going to lose the battle. So that's why automation is so critical to unlocking that experience, and then the richness of the environment really will let it kind of help your organization kind of stand the test of time to make sure that experience is paramount for the user.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. I know we're just about at the top of the hour, so Chet, I'll turn it back to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana and Brian. We appreciate everybody who's taken the time to listen in. Just as we've set the stage now, coming up, I point you to the screen here, on August 17th, we are actually going to do a deep dive into continuous compliance. And we're going to dig deep in there and show you how to set up those types of guardrails to help really accelerate people's ability to take advantage of the cloud by having these guardrails in place. I think that's going to be a great conversation. Going on top of that, we're going to talk about the automated cloud access orchestration on August 31st. And then our last one on September 9th will all be about the cloud budget visibility and control in the cloud. So we hope to see everybody there. We'll be sending out follow-on links so that people can register for these topics that you're interested in. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out. So you can reach out to info@cloudtamer.io, and we'd be happy to answer whatever questions you might have related to our topics today. Again, thank you much.